Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something that'll make your worst Monday feel like a vacation. Medieval prisons. And I'm not talking about the sanitized Hollywood version with noble knights locked in clean stone towers. I'm talking about the real thing. The kind of place where hope went to die and human dignity was just a distant memory. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously dark history, and subscribe if you want more content that'll make you grateful for modern life. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always love seeing our global community come together, even when we're talking about humanity's darkest chapters. Now, here's the thing that most people don't realize about medieval prisons. They weren't designed to rehabilitate anyone. They weren't even really designed to punish people, at least not in the way we think about punishment today. Medieval prisons existed for one simple, terrifying reason: to hold you until your trial. And here's the kicker. That trial might not happen for 10 years. 10 years. Imagine sitting in a cell, chained to a wall, slowly starving, waiting for a day in court that might never come. Because here's what medieval justice looked like. You were guilty until proven innocent. And proving your innocence was almost impossible when you were rotting away in a dungeon. The system was designed to break you long before you ever saw a judge. And if you think that sounds bad, just wait until you hear about what actually happened inside these places. Because what I'm about to tell you will make you understand why medieval people feared imprisonment more than death itself. Let's start with the most basic question. Who ended up in medieval prisons? Well, pretty much anyone who upset the wrong person. Steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. Prison. Speak out against your local lord. Prison. Owe someone money you can't pay back. Prison. Get accused of witchcraft by a neighbor who doesn't like you. Prison. The medieval justice system wasn't about protecting the innocent. It was about protecting the powerful. But here's where it gets really twisted. The moment you walked through those prison doors, you became a customer. That's right, medieval prisons were businesses. You had to pay rent for your cell. You had to pay for your food. You had to pay to have your chains removed. You had to pay for literally everything, including the privilege of not being tortured. And if you couldn't pay, well, that's when things got really interesting. The guards, whose salaries often depended on what they could squeeze out of prisoners, turned extortion into an art form. They'd charge you 4 times the legal limit just to remove your shackles. They'd sell you moldy bread at premium prices. They'd demand bribes to let your family visit. Some guards got so creative with their corruption that they'd arrest people just to shake them down for money. Edmund Lorimer, a 14th century prison keeper, was infamous for charging inmates ridiculous fees for basic human dignities. Hugh de Croydon made a career out of blackmailing his prisoners. These weren't rogue operators. This was the system. The entire medieval prison industry ran on human misery converted into profit. Now let's talk about what you'd actually experience if you found yourself locked up in one of these places. Picture this. You're dragged through the streets, probably already beaten and humiliated, and thrown into a building that looks more like a tomb than a place for living people. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Imagine the worst public bathroom you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 1,000 and add the sweet stench of rotting flesh. Because yes, people died in these places regularly, and their bodies weren't always removed quickly. The architecture itself was designed to crush your spirit. Thick stone walls that swallowed sound, so your screams for help would never reach the outside world. Tiny windows, if any, that let in just enough light to remind you that there was still a world out there that you'd probably never see again. And everything was built to feel massive and oppressive, to make you feel as small and powerless as possible. But the real horror began when they fitted you with your chains. Now, if you were wealthy, you could pay the sowet, the fee for staying unchained. The price varied wildly depending on how much the guards thought they could squeeze out of you. The keeper of Winchester Jail charged 5 pence. Coventry's prison code set the rate at 2p. Somerset's county jail demanded 1 shilling per week. But if you were poor, those chains were going on, and they were staying on until you died or somehow came up with the money. These weren't just simple restraints. Medieval chains were designed to cause maximum discomfort and control. Iron fetters around your ankles, connected by heavy links that made every step an ordeal. Manacles on your wrists that cut into your skin with every movement. Some prisoners were chained directly to the walls, unable to move more than a few feet in any direction. The weight of the metal alone was enough to cause permanent damage to your joints and muscles. And here's something that'll really make your skin crawl. The guards would deliberately make the chains too tight. Not tight enough to cut off circulation completely, because then you'd die too quickly, and they'd lose their income stream. Just tight enough to cause constant pain and slowly damage your limbs. It was torture designed to maximize suffering while keeping you alive long enough to extract every possible penny from your misery. The sleeping arrangements, if you can call them that, were beyond nightmarish. Forget about beds, forget about blankets. Most prisoners slept on bare stone floors that were perpetually damp from leaking walls and human waste. If you were lucky enough to afford straw, you'd be sharing it with rats, lice, and whatever diseases they carried. The straw itself would quickly become contaminated with bodily fluids and rot, creating a breeding ground for infections that could kill you in days. Temperature control was non-existent. In winter, prisoners would huddle together for warmth, but the stone walls and floors would suck the heat right out of your body. People regularly froze to death in their cells. In summer, the lack of ventilation turned prisons into sweltering death traps, where the air itself felt thick and poisonous. There was no escape from the elements, no comfort, no relief. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Prisoners were crammed together in spaces barely large enough for half their number. You'd be pressed against strangers, sharing their diseases, their desperation, their slow descent into madness. Personal space was a foreign concept. Everything you did, from eating to relieving yourself, happened in full view of dozens of other desperate people. Speaking of relieving yourself, let's talk about medieval prison sanitation, or rather, the complete lack thereof. There were no toilets, no running water, no waste disposal system. Prisoners simply went wherever they could, usually in corners of their cells, or in designated areas that were nothing more than open pits. The smell was indescribable. The health risks were enormous. Diseases spread like wildfire in these conditions. Human waste would accumulate for weeks or months without being cleaned. It would seep into the stone floors, creating permanent stains and odours that could never be removed. Prisoners would be forced to walk through, sit in, and sleep near their own filth and that of dozens of others. The psychological impact was devastating. You weren't just imprisoned, you were dehumanized, reduced to living like an animal in conditions no animal should endure. Water, when it was available, was often contaminated. Wells near prisons would become polluted from seepage, and guards had no incentive to provide clean drinking water to prisoners who couldn't pay for it. Many prisoners died not from starvation or violence, but from drinking water that was literally toxic. Others died from dehydration because they were too afraid to drink the filthy water that was offered. The medical care was practically non-existent. If you got sick, and you would get sick, there was no doctor coming to help you. Guards wouldn't even enter the worst parts of prisons because the conditions were so dangerous. Physicians refused to set foot in these places. If you developed an infection, broke a bone, or contracted a disease, you were on your own. Your fellow prisoners might try to help, but they were just as desperate and sick as you were. Wounds from chains and shackles would fester and become infected. Broken bones would heal improperly, leaving prisoners permanently disabled. Diseases like dysentery, typhus and plague would tear through prison populations, killing dozens at a time. The mortality rate in some medieval prisons was so high that mass graves became a regular necessity. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of medieval prison life was the psychological torture. The complete uncertainty about your fate would slowly drive you insane. You might wait months or years for a trial that might never come. You had no way of knowing if your family was trying to help you, if witnesses were being gathered for your defense, or if the outside world had simply forgotten you existed. The isolation was crushing. Cut off from sunlight, fresh air, and human companionship outside of fellow prisoners, people would begin to lose their grip on reality. Some prisoners would talk to themselves for hours. Others would retreat into complete silence. Many would simply give up, refusing to eat or drink until death released them from their suffering. The guards understood the psychological impact of their treatment and used it as another tool of control. They would deliberately withhold information about prisoners' cases, lie about family visits, and create false hope only to crush it later. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was systematic psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit. And through all of this, remember, you hadn't been convicted of anything yet. You were still technically innocent until proven guilty. But the medieval justice system had already decided your fate the moment those prison doors closed behind you. Whether you lived or died often depended not on your guilt or innocence, but on how much money you had and how long you could survive the systematic torture that passed for detention. This was just the beginning of your medieval prison experience. The daily routine of survival, the desperate search for food, the constant threat of violence from other prisoners and guards, the elaborate torture devices that awaited those who couldn't or wouldn't confess to their crimes. All of this was still to come. The daily struggle for food in medieval prisons was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. And I mean that literally. Food deprivation wasn't just neglect, it was a calculated weapon used to control and break prisoners. You see, the guards quickly figured out that a starving person will do absolutely anything to survive, including confess to crimes they never committed. Here's how the system worked. Your daily rations, if you could even call them that, consisted of whatever scraps the guards felt like giving you. We're talking about bread that was so mouldy it looked like a science experiment. Water that was brown and smelled like sewage. Sometimes, if you were extremely lucky, you might get a thin gruel that was mostly water with a few floating bits of grain. But here's the catch. Even these pathetic rations weren't free. Everything had a price. A piece of stale bread might cost you a day's wages if you had any money left. Clean water was a luxury item that most prisoners simply couldn't afford. And if you complained about the quality, well, the guards would just smile and remind you that you could always choose to eat nothing at all. The psychological torture of watching food slowly destroy your body was devastating. Chroniclers from the time describe prisoners so desperate that they would eat straw from their bedding. They would chew on leather scraps from their clothing. Some would try to eat dirt or stones, anything to fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The human body can survive about 3 weeks without food, but your mind starts breaking down much sooner than that. Guards would use food as a disciplinary tool in ways that would make modern prison wardens sick to their stomachs. Miss a payment for your cell rent? No food for 3 days. Speak out against the guards' treatment? Your bread ration gets cut in half. Try to help a fellow prisoner who's dying. Well, now you're both going hungry. It was systematic starvation designed to turn prisoners against each other and eliminate any sense of solidarity or rebellion. The wealthy prisoners, those who could afford to pay premium prices, lived in a completely different reality. Some of them could actually arrange to have meals brought in from outside. We're talking about roasted meat, fresh bread, wine, even delicacies like imported fruits and cheeses. They would eat these feasts in front of starving prisoners, a daily reminder that in medieval society, even basic human needs were privileges reserved for those who could pay. But the most horrifying aspect of medieval prison food culture happened during times of widespread famine. When the Great Famine struck Europe from 1315 to 1317, conditions inside prisons became so desperate that something unthinkable happened. Prisoners began eating each other. Historical records describe inmates attacking and devouring newcomers, literally tearing them apart while they were still alive. These weren't isolated incidents. This was survival cannibalism on a massive scale, and it shows just how completely the system had broken down human civilization within prison walls. Now, let's talk about the creatures you'd be sharing your cell with, because you were definitely not going to be alone in there. Medieval prisons were ecosystems of disease and death, crawling with vermin that carried plagues capable of wiping out entire populations. Rats were everywhere. Not just a few rats, but swarms of them, bold enough to steal food right out of prisoners' hands, and aggressive enough to bite anyone too weak to fight back. These weren't cute pet store rats. Medieval rats were massive, diseased creatures that had grown fat, feeding on human waste and corpses. They carried fleas infected with bubonic plague, the same disease that had already killed 1/3 of Europe's population. When these fleas bit prisoners, they injected bacteria directly into their bloodstream. The mortality rate for septicemic plague in medieval times was 99 to 100%. If you got bit by the wrong flea, you were dead within days, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to save you. But rats were just the beginning of your pest problems. Lice covered everything, including your body. They would burrow into your scalp, your clothing, your bedding, creating an itching sensation so intense that prisoners would scratch themselves bloody. These lice also carried typhus, another deadly disease that spread like wildfire through prison populations. The combination of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lice infestations created perfect conditions for epidemic outbreaks. Mice scurried through the cells, contaminating what little food prisoners had. Cockroaches covered the walls in living sheets. Flies swarmed around human waste and open wounds. Spiders built webs in corners, and prisoners would sometimes eat them out of desperation. The entire environment was a biological nightmare where every surface teemed with life forms that wanted to feed on your suffering body. The guards, understanding how dangerous these conditions were, rarely entered the worst parts of the prison. They would stand at safe distances and throw food into cells, letting prisoners fight over scraps while avoiding contact with the disease-ridden environment they had created. Even physicians refused to enter medieval prisons, claiming the conditions were too dangerous for anyone to survive. Speaking of survival, let's discuss the elaborate torture devices that awaited prisoners who couldn't or wouldn't confess to their crimes. The medieval justice system operated on a simple principle. If you confess, your suffering ends quickly. If you don't confess, your suffering becomes unimaginable. And they had centuries to perfect the art of extracting confessions through pain. The Judas cradle was arguably the most terrifying device ever created. Picture a wooden pyramid, sharpened to a point, mounted on a frame. Prisoners would be slowly lowered onto this point, which would gradually pierce their most sensitive areas. Their hands and feet would be tied, so they couldn't shift their weight or escape the penetration. The torture could continue for hours or days, depending on how quickly they confessed. The damage was always permanent, assuming they survived at all. The rack was more common, but no less horrifying. This rectangular wooden frame had rollers on each end. Prisoners would be chained to these rollers, with their ankles fastened to one end and their wrists chained to the other. Slowly, systematically, the torturer would turn handles that rotated the rollers, stretching the prisoner's body until their joints began to separate. First, you'd hear cartilage snapping, then ligaments tearing. Finally, bones would crack with sounds so loud they could be heard throughout the prison. The psychological impact of these devices was often more effective than their physical use. Prisoners would be brought into torture chambers and shown the instruments that awaited them if they didn't confess. Many people would break down immediately, admitting to anything and everything just to avoid being strapped to these machines. Others would be forced to watch fellow prisoners being tortured, knowing their turn was coming next. But perhaps the most insidious form of torture was the complete destruction of hope. Medieval prisons were designed to make you believe that your situation was permanent, that no one was coming to save you, and that death was your only escape. Guards would lie about family visits that never happened. They would claim that your case had been forgotten by the courts. They would tell you that your loved ones had stopped trying to help you. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Prisoners would lose track of time in the eternal darkness of their cells. Days and nights blurred together into an endless nightmare of pain, hunger, and despair. Some people would retreat into complete madness, talking to invisible companions or believing they were already dead. Others would become catatonic, simply shutting down mentally to escape the horror of their reality. The isolation was perhaps worse than the physical torture. Human beings are social creatures, and prolonged isolation can break the mind faster than any device. Many prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for months or years, with no human contact except for guards who treated them like dangerous animals. The silence would become so complete that prisoners would begin to hear voices or hallucinate conversations with people who weren't there. And remember, throughout all of this systematic torture and dehumanization, the majority of these prisoners had never been convicted of any crime. They were still legally innocent, waiting for trials that might never come. The medieval justice system had created a machine that consumed human beings and converted their suffering into profit and social control. But the horror didn't end with individual suffering. Medieval prisons served as recruitment centers for corruption that infected entire communities. Guards who learned to profit from human misery didn't limit their activities to prison walls. They would carry their extortion techniques into the streets, shaking down ordinary citizens and using their positions of authority to build criminal empires. The economic impact rippled through society in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Families would bankrupt themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives alive. Entire communities would be terrorized by corrupt officials who had learned that human suffering was more profitable than honest work. The medieval prison system didn't just destroy individual lives, it poisoned the entire concept of justice and created a culture where might truly did make right. And we're still not done exploring the depths of medieval prison horror. The specialized facilities for different types of prisoners, the elaborate hierarchies of suffering based on social class, the public spectacles designed to terrorize entire populations. All of this was part of a system so thoroughly evil that it challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The worst part, this wasn't ancient history happening in some distant, primitive society. This was happening in the same cities where magnificent cathedrals were being built, where universities were teaching philosophy and mathematics, where artists were creating works of beauty that still inspire us today. Medieval civilization was capable of incredible achievements, but it chose to channel much of its creativity and resources into perfecting the art of human suffering. The class system in medieval prisons created two completely different realities existing side by side, and understanding this divide reveals just how twisted medieval justice really was. If you were wealthy, prison could actually be somewhat bearable. We're talking about private rooms, servants bringing you meals from outside, comfortable beds, and even the ability to conduct business from your cell. Some noble prisoners lived better in prison than most free peasants lived in their homes. But if you were poor, you were basically sentenced to slow death by torture. The same crime that got a wealthy merchant a comfortable room with visiting privileges would land a peasant in chains in a dungeon where rats would eat his toes while he was still alive. This wasn't just unfair. It was systematic genocide against the poor, disguised as justice. At the Tower of London, which housed some of history's most famous prisoners, the contrast was staggering. Scottish King John Balliol brought an entire staff of servants with him to prison. Anne Boleyn, even while awaiting execution, was housed in the same luxurious apartments where she had celebrated her coronation. Meanwhile, Common prisoners in the same building were chained in sewage-filled cellars, forgotten by the world above. The wealthy could literally buy their way out of torture. They paid fees to avoid shackles, fees for better food, fees for private cells, fees for family visits. Everything had a price, and if you could pay, you could avoid most of the horrors that defined medieval prison life. Some rich prisoners even held dinner parties in their cells, entertaining guests, while poor prisoners starved to death just floors below. But here's what's really sick about this system. The profits from wealthy prisoners were used to fund the torture of poor ones. The money that bought a nobleman comfort also paid for the chains, the torture devices, and the guards who operated them. Luxury and horror existed in the same buildings, funded by the same corrupt economy. The guards understood this dynamic perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. They would deliberately make conditions worse for poor prisoners to encourage wealthy ones to pay even more for protection. If you had money, guards would hint about terrible things that could happen unless you paid extra fees. If you didn't have money, those terrible things would happen to you as an example to others. This created a psychological torture that went beyond physical pain. Poor prisoners could see exactly how much better their lives could be if they just had money. They could smell the roasted meat from wealthy prisoners' cells while they starved. They could hear conversations and laughter from the comfortable sections while they lay in chains. The proximity of comfort made their own suffering even more unbearable. Now let's talk about Newgate Prison, which stands as perhaps the most horrific example of what medieval imprisonment really looked like for ordinary people. This place was so bad that even other medieval prisons looked civilized in comparison. The death rate was so high that investigators couldn't keep up with documenting the casualties. We're talking about 62 deaths in just 2 years that required coroner investigations, and those were only the deaths suspicious enough to warrant official attention. The architecture of Newgate was designed specifically to maximize human suffering. Prisoners sentenced to death were kept in cellars beneath the keeper's house that were essentially open sewers lined with chains and shackles. These weren't cells. They were tomb-like pits where human beings were stored like contaminated waste until their execution dates. Common debtors were sent to something called the Stone Hall, while common felons went to the Stone Hold. Both areas were deliberately kept unlit and filthy. The darkness was so complete that prisoners would lose all sense of time, unable to tell day from night. The dampness would seep into your bones, creating arthritis and joint pain that made every movement agony. The dungeons were so depraved that physicians refused to enter them. Think about that for a moment. Medical professionals, people trained to help the sick and dying, considered these places too dangerous to approach. The air itself was toxic, filled with disease-bearing vapors from rotting waste and decomposing bodies. Guards would hold cloths over their faces when they had to enter, and they'd leave as quickly as possible. Prisoners who could afford alcohol from the prisoner-run drinking cellar would stay perpetually drunk just to numb themselves to the horror of their existence. This wasn't recreational drinking. It was medical self-treatment to avoid complete mental breakdown. The alcohol was often contaminated and dangerous, but prisoners preferred the risk of poisoning to the certainty of psychological torture that came with sobriety. Lice covered everything and everyone. Not just a few lice, but swarms of them so thick that prisoners' clothing would appear to move on its own. These parasites would burrow into scalps, creating infected sores that never healed properly. They would lay eggs in clothing seams, ensuring that even if you managed to kill some of them, more would hatch within days. The jailers would chain prisoners to walls and then simply abandon them. People would hang from their shackles for days without food or water, their wrists and ankles slowly being cut to the bone by metal restraints. Some prisoners would hang there until they died, their bodies left as warnings to other inmates about what happened when you couldn't pay your fees. From 1315 to 1316, the coroner was investigating deaths at such a rapid pace that the paperwork became overwhelming. These weren't natural deaths from old age or illness. These were deaths from starvation, torture, disease, and despair. Young, healthy people were dying within weeks of entering Newgate, their bodies unable to survive conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. The smell inside Newgate was so intense that people could detect it from blocks away. It was a combination of human waste, rotting food, infected wounds, and decomposing corpses that had been left in cells too long. This smell would cling to anyone who entered the prison, marking them as contaminated and dangerous to the outside world. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Newgate was how normalized the horror had become. Guards, prisoners, and even officials treated the daily atrocities as routine business. Death was so common that bodies would pile up in corridors while paperwork was processed. The systematic dehumanization was so complete that people stopped seeing prisoners as human beings worthy of basic dignity. The regulations that existed on paper proved just how widespread the abuses were. Officials weren't supposed to steal charity food meant for prisoners, but they did it constantly. They weren't supposed to charge excessive fees for basic necessities, but price gouging was standard practice. They weren't supposed to demand bribes for bringing prisoners to trial, but the entire system ran on corruption. These rules existed because the abuses were universal, not because they were rare exceptions. Every medieval prison operated as a criminal enterprise where human suffering was converted into profit through systematic torture, extortion, and neglect. The fact that authorities felt the need to write down these obvious moral guidelines shows how completely the system had abandoned any pretense of justice or humanity. The economic model of medieval prisons created incentives for maximum cruelty. Guards and wardens made more money when prisoners suffered more. Dead prisoners couldn't pay fees, but prisoners who were kept just barely alive could be milked for money indefinitely. This created a sophisticated torture economy, where officials calculated exactly how much pain they could inflict while keeping their victims alive long enough to extract maximum profit. Families would bankrupt themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives alive, selling everything they owned to pay the endless fees and bribes demanded by guards. Children would grow up in poverty because their parents had spent the family fortune trying to keep a grandfather or uncle from starving to death in prison. The economic impact rippled through entire communities, destroying multiple generations of families. The corruption wasn't limited to individual guards acting badly. This was institutional evil, built into the very structure of medieval justice. Prison keepers like Edmund Lorimer and Hugh de Croydon weren't rogue operators. They were successful businessmen working within a system designed to reward cruelty. Their techniques were copied by other officials because they were profitable and effective. Some guards developed sliding scales of corruption, charging different rates for different crimes, or adjusting their extortion based on what they thought prisoners could afford. Jehan de Beaucaine, a police chief in 13th century France, was so notoriously corrupt that he was eventually prosecuted for his crimes. But within 3 years, he was back in law enforcement, using his connections and money to buy his way into another position where he could resume his profitable criminal activities. This wasn't individual moral failure. It was systematic institutional corruption that infected every level of medieval justice. The people responsible for protecting society had become predators who viewed citizens as potential victims to be exploited. The distinction between criminal and law enforcement officer had completely broken down, creating a world where those with power could commit any atrocity as long as it was profitable. The psychological impact on society was devastating. People lived in constant fear, not just of criminals, but of the justice system itself. Being accused of a crime, even falsely, could destroy your entire family's future. The mere threat of imprisonment was enough to control entire populations, creating a culture of fear and submission that benefited those in power. Medieval prisons also served as schools for corruption, teaching guards and officials that human suffering was a renewable resource that could be harvested for personal gain. These lessons didn't stay within prison walls. The techniques developed for torturing prisoners were adapted for use against ordinary citizens, creating a culture where might truly did make right. The specialization of medieval prisons created even more opportunities for abuse and corruption. York had separate facilities for different types of criminals, each with its own system of fees and tortures. The Sheriff of York had his prison, the Mayor had another, and even the church maintained its own facility for wayward clergy. This competition between institutions led to innovation in cruelty, as each facility tried to maximize profits from their prisoner populations. The Forest Prison in York was specifically designed for people who violated hunting laws in royal forests. These weren't violent criminals. They were usually starving peasants who had killed deer to feed their families. But they were subjected to the same systematic torture and extortion as murderers and thieves, showing how completely the system had lost any connection to proportional justice. Church prisons were supposed to be more lenient, which created a perverse incentive for accused criminals to claim religious status. People would lie about being clergy members just to avoid the horrors of secular prisons, leading to elaborate schemes and bribery to obtain false religious credentials. This corruption of religious institutions showed how thoroughly the prison system had poisoned medieval society. The hierarchy of suffering was carefully maintained through architectural design and daily routines. Wealthy prisoners were housed in upper floors with windows and ventilation, while poor prisoners were kept in underground dungeons that flooded during heavy rains. The physical structure of the buildings reinforced social class distinctions and ensured that even in prison, the poor suffered more than the rich. Guards would deliberately move prisoners between different sections based on their ability to pay, using better conditions as leverage for extortion. A prisoner might start in a relatively comfortable cell, but as their money ran out, they would be moved to progressively worse areas until they ended up chained in the sewage-filled dungeons reserved for those who couldn't pay. This created a constant state of anxiety among prisoners who knew that their current conditions, however bad, could always get worse. The threat of being moved to a more horrific section was used to maintain discipline and extract payments from families who were already financially destroyed by the imprisonment process. The public nature of medieval punishment added another layer of psychological torture that extended far beyond prison walls. Prisoners were often displayed in pillories or stocks in town squares, where crowds would gather to mock, taunt, and physically abuse them. This wasn't just punishment for the individual, it was entertainment for the masses and a warning to anyone who might consider challenging authority. The pillory was specifically designed to maximize humiliation while preventing prisoners from protecting themselves. With their heads and hands locked in wooden frames, prisoners were completely vulnerable to anything the crowd wanted to do to them. People would throw rotting food, human waste, rocks, and anything else they could find. Some prisoners died from injuries sustained during these public humiliation sessions. But the real purpose of these public spectacles was to terrorize the general population into submission. Everyone could see exactly what happened to people who upset the authorities, and the message was clear. This could happen to you too. The psychological impact on observers was almost as important as the physical impact on prisoners, creating a climate of fear that made rebellion unthinkable for most people. The medieval justice system understood that fear was more effective than actual punishment for controlling large populations. By making examples of a few individuals through spectacular public torture, they could intimidate thousands of others into compliance. The prison system wasn't really about justice or rehabilitation. It was about social control through terror. Medieval prisons represented the perfect intersection of greed, cruelty, and institutional power, creating a machine that converted human suffering into profit while maintaining social control through fear. Every aspect of the system was designed to maximize both pain and revenue, showing how completely medieval society had abandoned any pretense of justice or human dignity when dealing with the powerless. The daily reality of medieval prison life was so far removed from modern concepts of justice that it challenges our understanding of civilization itself. These weren't temporary holding facilities or rehabilitation centers. They were torture factories, where human beings were systematically destroyed for the profit and entertainment of those in power. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this system worked exactly as designed. It generated enormous profits for those who operated it, maintained social control through terror, and eliminated inconvenient people while providing legal cover for what amounted to systematic murder. Medieval society created the perfect machine for converting human beings into profit, and they operated it for centuries with ruthless efficiency. But the truly twisted genius of medieval prison corruption went even deeper than simple extortion. The system created what we might call criminal franchises, where successful prison operators would train others in their techniques and expand their operations across multiple facilities. These weren't isolated incidents of bad behavior. They were sophisticated business models that treated human suffering as a renewable resource. Take Thomas Asplund's case from the late 15th century. This poor man was charged £10 by the Sheriff of Cambridge just to have his chains removed. £10. To put that in perspective, that was more than most people made in an entire year. When Asplund later refused to pay, claiming he'd only agreed under duress, the sheriff simply arrested him again and threw him back into prison, this time with orders that none of his friends or family could visit until the fee was paid in full. This created a perfect extortion loop. The sheriff could arrest you, charge you outrageous fees for basic human treatment, and then arrest you again when you couldn't pay. It was a perpetual money machine fueled by human desperation, and it was completely legal because the sheriffs wrote the rules. But here's what makes this even more insidious. The prison operators understood psychology better than most modern criminals. They knew exactly how to break people down systematically, using a combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and social isolation that would leave prisoners completely dependent on their captors for survival. The process usually started with what they called softening up new prisoners. You'd be thrown into the worst possible conditions for your first few weeks, chained in the most brutal way possible, given the most contaminated food, placed with the most violent inmates. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated conditioning designed to make you grateful for any small improvement in your treatment. After a few weeks of absolute hell, a guard might offer you a slightly better cell, slightly cleaner water, or permission to have your family visit, all for a reasonable fee, of course. By this point, you'd been broken down so completely that these tiny improvements would seem like magnificent gifts, and you'd pay whatever they asked without question. This technique was so effective that prisoners would actually become emotionally attached to the guards who were torturing them. Stockholm Syndrome isn't a modern phenomenon. Medieval prison operators perfected it centuries ago. Prisoners would defend their captors, make excuses for the abuse, and even inform on fellow inmates who tried to organize resistance or escape attempts. The guards also understood how to use hope as a weapon. They would periodically give prisoners false information about their cases, claiming that their trials were being scheduled or that important witnesses were coming forward. This would give prisoners just enough hope to keep them alive and paying fees, but the promises would never materialize. The psychological torture of constantly raised and crushed expectations was often more devastating than physical pain. Some prison operators became so sophisticated that they would actually study their prisoners' backgrounds to develop personalized torture strategies. If you were a proud person, they would focus on humiliation. If you were deeply religious, they would force you to commit acts that violated your beliefs. If you had strong family bonds, they would threaten your relatives. Every prisoner's psychological profile was analyzed and exploited for maximum effect. The medical neglect in medieval prisons wasn't just callous indifference, it was another profit center. Guards would deliberately allow prisoners to become sick, then offer medical treatment for exorbitant fees. We're talking about charging people for bandages to wrap infected wounds that the guards had caused in the first place. They would withhold basic medical care until families paid bribes, essentially holding prisoners' lives hostage for money. Some guards became expert at inflicting injuries that looked accidental but required ongoing expensive treatment. A slip that caused a broken bone, a fall that resulted in internal bleeding, an accident with contaminated food that led to dysentery. These incidents would generate weeks or months of additional fees as families desperately tried to keep their loved ones alive. The prison medical system, such as it was, operated on the principle that suffering was profitable, but death was not. Guards learned exactly how much damage they could inflict while keeping prisoners alive long enough to extract maximum payments. This required a sophisticated understanding of human physiology and pain tolerance that rivals anything modern torturers have developed. Women prisoners faced additional horrors that the system exploited with particular cruelty. Female inmates were routinely sexually assaulted by guards, but they could pay fees to be housed in protected areas away from the worst predators. This protection was never guaranteed and had to be renewed regularly, creating another ongoing revenue stream based on the threat of sexual violence. Pregnant women were kept in conditions that almost guaranteed miscarriage, then charged medical fees for dealing with the complications. Children born in prison were immediately separated from their mothers unless families could pay custody fees. The systematic destruction of family bonds was another tool for psychological torture and financial exploitation. The treatment of elderly prisoners was particularly vicious. Guards knew that older inmates were more vulnerable to the harsh conditions and would die more quickly without special care. Families of elderly prisoners were charged premium rates for heated cells, softer bedding, and more nutritious food, all while knowing that their loved ones would probably die anyway. The seasonal variations in prison conditions created additional opportunities for extortion. Winter brought freezing temperatures that could kill prisoners in unheated cells, so families were charged extra for firewood and warmer clothing. Summer brought diseases and contaminated water, requiring payments for better sanitation and medical care. Every change in weather was monetized through human suffering. Prison operators would also manipulate the legal system itself to maximize their profits. They would bribe court officials to delay trials, keeping prisoners in custody longer. They would provide false testimony to ensure convictions, knowing that convicted prisoners could be held indefinitely and charged ongoing maintenance fees. Some prison operators actually owned interests in the courts that sentenced people to their facilities. The corruption was so systematic that entire legal jurisdictions became criminal enterprises. Judges, sheriffs, prison operators, and court clerks all worked together to maximize the number of people imprisoned and the length of their sentences. Justice wasn't just for sale, it was a commodity produced and marketed by organized criminal networks that happened to hold government positions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval prison corruption was how it infected the broader society. Children grew up watching their parents pay bribes to corrupt officials, learning that money was more important than justice. Merchants learned to factor corruption costs into their business expenses. Entire communities became complicit in systems they knew were evil, because the alternative was becoming victims themselves. The economic impact went far beyond individual families. Communities would lose their most productive members to imprisonment, creating labor shortages and economic decline. The constant threat of arbitrary arrest made long-term business planning impossible, stifling economic development. The money extracted through prison corruption was essentially a tax on productivity that funded the expansion of criminal government. Medieval prisons also served as testing grounds for new forms of torture and control that would later be exported to other institutions. Techniques developed for breaking prisoners were adapted for use against political dissidents, religious minorities, and anyone else who challenged authority. The prison system became a research and development center for oppression. The international network of medieval prison operators shared information and techniques across national boundaries. A torture method developed in English prisons would appear in French facilities within months. Successful extortion strategies would spread across Europe like epidemics, creating a standardized system of abuse that transcended local laws and customs. Some prison operators became so wealthy and powerful that they essentially ruled their territories like feudal lords. They owned vast estates, controlled local politics, and commanded private armies funded by prison profits. These weren't just corrupt officials, they were criminal warlords who had legalized their operations through control of the justice system. The record-keeping from medieval prisons reveals the industrial scale of the operation. Detailed ledgers show thousands of prisoners processed through individual facilities, with careful accounting of fees collected, bribes paid, and deaths recorded. This wasn't chaotic violence, it was organized crime operating with corporate efficiency and government protection. The psychological research conducted by medieval prison operators was remarkably sophisticated. They understood concepts like learned helplessness, social isolation, and behavioral conditioning that wouldn't be formally studied by psychologists for centuries. This knowledge was passed down through networks of practitioners who refined their techniques across generations. The training programs for medieval prison guards were essentially schools for professional torturers. New employees would learn not just how to inflict physical pain, but how to break people psychologically, how to maximize profits from prisoners, and how to avoid leaving evidence that could be used against them in court. These weren't untrained thugs. They were skilled professionals in the business of human destruction. The quality control systems in medieval prisons ensured consistent levels of suffering across different facilities. Prison operators would inspect each other's facilities, sharing best practices for maximizing prisoner mortality while avoiding legal consequences. They developed standardized procedures for everything from chain placement to food contamination that guaranteed uniform misery. The customer service aspects of medieval prison corruption were particularly twisted. Prison operators would actually compete for prisoners, offering kickbacks to judges and sheriffs who sent them business. They would advertise their services to potential clients, promising specific levels of torture and guaranteeing prisoner deaths within predetermined timeframes. The medieval prison system represents one of humanity's most successful experiments in institutionalized evil. Every aspect was designed, tested, and refined over centuries to maximize both human suffering and financial profit. It wasn't the result of ignorance or primitive conditions. It was the product of sophisticated criminal minds working within legal frameworks they had corrupted for their own purposes. The efficiency of the system was terrifying. Medieval prison operators could process thousands of prisoners annually, extracting maximum value from each victim while maintaining plausible deniability about the systematic nature of their operations. They had solved the logistical challenges of large-scale torture and murder while generating enormous profits and maintaining social control. The legacy of medieval prison corruption extends far beyond its historical period. Many of the techniques developed by medieval prison operators were later adopted by totalitarian regimes, organized crime syndicates, and other institutions dedicated to human oppression. The medieval period essentially created the blueprint for systematic state terrorism that continues to influence authoritarian systems today. Understanding the true nature of medieval prisons reveals something disturbing about human nature itself. These weren't systems created by monsters or psychopaths. They were developed and operated by ordinary people who learned to profit from suffering. The guards, wardens, judges, and officials who ran these facilities went home to their families each night, attended church on Sundays, and considered themselves respectable members of society. The normalization of extreme cruelty in medieval prisons shows how quickly civilized people can adapt to participating in evil when the right incentives are in place. The system didn't require sadists or sociopaths to function. It just needed people who were willing to prioritize personal profit over human compassion. And apparently, such people were abundant in medieval society. The documentation from medieval prisons also reveals the remarkable creativity humans can display. when motivated by greed and power. The variety of torture techniques, extortion schemes, and psychological manipulation strategies developed by prison operators shows a level of innovation that rivals any legitimate field of human endeavor. Unfortunately, all of this creativity was channeled toward causing maximum human suffering. The business models developed by medieval prison operators were so successful that they persisted for centuries with only minor modifications. The basic structure of systematic torture for profit remained unchanged because it worked exactly as designed. This consistency across time and geography suggests that the medieval prison system represented a kind of evolutionary peak in the development of institutionalized cruelty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval prison history is how completely it was accepted by society. These weren't secret operations hidden from public view. They were integral parts of the legal system that operated with full community knowledge and approval. People knew what happened in these places, and they supported the system because they believed it protected them from criminals and maintained social order. The medieval period created a perfect storm of conditions that allowed systematic evil to flourish. Weak central authority, local control of justice, economic incentives for cruelty, and a social hierarchy that devalued human life based on class status. These conditions combined to produce institutions that were more brutal and efficient than anything created by modern totalitarian regimes. The survival rate in medieval prisons was so low that imprisonment was essentially a death sentence carried out through prolonged torture rather than quick execution. The system was designed to extract maximum value from each prisoner before they died, creating an economy based on the systematic consumption of human lives. This wasn't accidental. It was the intended outcome of policies carefully crafted to balance profit maximization with social control. The medieval prison system also demonstrates how legal frameworks can be manipulated to legitimize any level of cruelty. By operating within technically legal boundaries, prison operators could commit atrocities that would be considered war crimes today, while maintaining their status as respected law enforcement officials. The system shows how easily the rule of law can be perverted to serve criminal purposes when those who write the laws are themselves criminals. The reach of medieval prison corruption extended into every corner of society, creating what we might call a culture of institutional sadism that infected entire kingdoms. But here's what's really disturbing. The people running these systems weren't born monsters. They were ordinary individuals who discovered that human suffering could be converted into personal wealth, and they built entire careers around that discovery. Consider the daily routine of a medieval prison guard. You'd wake up in your comfortable home, kiss your wife goodbye, and walk to work, knowing that your income for the day would depend on how much pain you could inflict on desperate people. You'd develop techniques for maximizing suffering while keeping prisoners alive long enough to extract ongoing payments. You'd learn to read people's breaking points, to identify which psychological buttons to push for maximum effect. These guards became experts in human psychology out of pure greed. They could tell which prisoners would break under physical torture and which ones needed psychological manipulation. They knew exactly how much food deprivation it took to make someone confess to crimes they never committed. They understood that threatening a prisoner's family was often more effective than threatening the prisoner directly. The sophistication of their methods was truly disturbing. Guards would create elaborate good cop, bad cop scenarios where one guard would brutalize a prisoner, while another would offer small kindnesses in exchange for information or money. They would rotate torture techniques to prevent prisoners from adapting to any single form of abuse. They would use other prisoners as informants, creating paranoia and mistrust that made organized resistance impossible. But perhaps most twisted of all, they would offer hope as a commodity. For the right price, a guard might promise to deliver a message to your family, hint that your trial was being scheduled, or suggest that a key witness was about to come forward in your defense. These promises were almost always lies, but desperate people would pay anything for even the possibility of freedom. The training process for new guards reveals just how systematic this cruelty had become. Experienced guards would mentor newcomers, teaching them not just the physical techniques of torture, but the business aspects of prison management. New guards learned how to assess a prisoner's financial resources, how to gradually increase fees without triggering family bankruptcy too quickly, and how to maintain prisoner health just well enough to maximize profit extraction. They were taught to view prisoners not as human beings, but as renewable resources that needed to be managed efficiently. A prisoner who died too quickly represented lost revenue. A prisoner who escaped meant forfeiture of all future payments. The goal was to find the sweet spot where prisoners suffered maximally while remaining alive and profitable for as long as possible. The guard training programs also included instruction in legal manipulation. Guards learned which laws they could break without consequences, how to falsify records to cover up deaths, and how to intimidate witnesses who might testify against them. They were taught to work within the system while completely subverting its intended purpose. Advanced guards would learn specialty skills like forgery, poisoning, and psychological manipulation. Some became expert at creating evidence to frame innocent people, generating new customers for their services. Others specialized in breaking particular types of prisoners, religious individuals, merchants, or political dissidents. The level of professionalization was remarkable for what was essentially organized criminal activity. The career advancement opportunities in medieval prison systems attracted ambitious sociopaths who saw human suffering as a pathway to wealth and status. Successful guards could become wardens, sheriffs, or even judges, carrying their torture expertise into higher levels of the justice system. The most successful prison operators became wealthy landowners who controlled entire regions through fear and corruption. Some guards developed signature techniques that became famous throughout the prison network. They would take pride in their ability to break prisoners who had resisted other torturers. They would compete with colleagues to see who could extract the most money from families or who could keep prisoners alive longest while inflicting maximum pain. It was professionalization of cruelty that turned torture into a respected craft. The record-keeping systems developed by medieval prisons were remarkably detailed for their time. Guards maintained careful logs of prisoner payments, torture sessions, and medical conditions. They tracked which techniques were most effective on different types of prisoners and shared this information with other facilities. This wasn't casual brutality, it was scientific torture conducted with the precision of a medical experiment. The economic analysis conducted by prison operators was surprisingly sophisticated. They calculated the optimal balance between prisoner mortality and profit extraction. They studied seasonal variations in death rates and adjusted their techniques accordingly. They analyzed which types of prisoners were most profitable and worked with judges to ensure steady supplies of their preferred victims. The international networks established by medieval prison operators facilitated the spread of torture techniques across national boundaries. A new method of psychological manipulation developed in England would appear in French prisons within months. Successful business models would be copied and adapted to local conditions. There was essentially a global market in human suffering managed by professional torturers. The quality control standards maintained by these networks ensured consistent levels of brutality across different facilities. Prison operators would inspect each other's facilities, providing feedback and suggestions for improvement. They developed standardized procedures that guaranteed uniform suffering regardless of location. This wasn't random violence, it was industrial-scale torture managed with corporate efficiency. The customer service aspects of medieval prison operations were particularly disturbing. Prison operators would actually market their services to potential clients, promising specific outcomes for specific fees. They would guarantee prisoner deaths within predetermined timeframes, or offer money-back guarantees for failed torture sessions. They treated human destruction as a product to be sold like any other commodity. The competition between different prison facilities led to innovation in cruelty as operators tried to differentiate their services. Some prisons specialized in psychological torture, others focused on physical pain, and still others offered combination packages that included both. This market competition drove continuous improvement in torture techniques and business practices. The customer testimonials preserved in medieval records show how satisfied clients were with prison services. Judges would write recommendations for particularly effective prison operators. Wealthy families would request specific facilities for their enemies. The reputation systems that developed around torture effectiveness show how completely society had accepted and embraced systematic cruelty. The seasonal pricing strategies employed by prison operators demonstrated their business sophistication. Rates would increase during winter months when heating costs were higher. Summer brought premium charges for medical care during disease outbreaks. Holiday periods saw special rates for family visits and improved food. Every aspect of prisoner suffering was monetized through dynamic pricing models. The insurance systems developed by prison operators protected them against revenue losses from prisoner deaths or escapes. They would form consortiums that shared risks across multiple facilities. Some operators offered guarantees to clients that their enemies would suffer for specific periods, regardless of circumstances. These risk management strategies showed remarkable business acumen applied to human destruction. The investment opportunities created by successful prison operations attracted capital from wealthy merchants and nobles who saw torture as a profitable business venture. Some prisons operated as joint stock companies with shareholders who received dividends based on prisoner suffering. The financialization of human pain created new asset classes in medieval markets. The research and development activities conducted by prison operators led to continuous innovation in torture techniques and business practices. They maintained experimental facilities where new methods were tested on prisoners before being implemented more widely. They conducted controlled studies comparing the effectiveness of different torture techniques. This scientific approach to cruelty produced rapid advances in the field. The patent systems developed by medieval torture specialists protected their intellectual property in new methods of inflicting pain. Successful techniques would be licensed to other facilities for fees. The most innovative torturers became wealthy by selling their expertise to less creative operators. There was literally a market for ideas about how to cause maximum human suffering. The apprenticeship programs established by master torturers ensured that their knowledge would be passed down to future generations. Young men would train for years under experienced practitioners, learning not just the physical techniques, but the business aspects of torture management. These educational systems preserved and refined torture knowledge across centuries. The professional associations formed by prison operators allowed them to share information, establish industry standards, and lobby for favorable legislation. They would meet regularly to discuss new techniques, market conditions, and regulatory challenges. They operated like any other professional guild, except their profession was systematically destroying human lives. The retirement planning available to successful prison operators showed how lucrative the torture business could be. Many guards and wardens accumulated enough wealth to purchase estates and live as landed gentry. Some founded their own prison facilities or invested in other torture-related businesses. The career prospects in systematic cruelty were remarkably good for those with strong stomachs. The legacy planning conducted by wealthy prison operators ensured that their torture empires would continue after their deaths. They would train their sons and nephews in the business, passing down both techniques and client relationships. Some established family dynasties that controlled prison systems for generations, creating hereditary torture kingdoms. The charitable activities undertaken by successful prison operators show how they used their wealth to gain social respectability. They would donate money to churches, fund public works, and sponsor community events. This philanthropy helped legitimize fortunes built on human suffering and provided social cover for their criminal activities. The political influence wielded by wealthy prison operators allowed them to shape legislation in their favor. They would bribe lawmakers to pass laws creating more crimes punishable by imprisonment. They would lobby for longer sentences and harsher conditions. They essentially bought the legal system and redesigned it to serve their business interests. The international diplomacy conducted by prison operators facilitated the exchange of prisoners between different kingdoms. They would negotiate treaties, allowing them to torture foreign nationals in exchange for similar privileges abroad. These agreements created international markets in human suffering that operated with government sanction. The technological innovations developed by medieval prison operators included new types of chains, improved torture devices, and better methods of prisoner control. They invested heavily in research and development, constantly seeking ways to improve their efficiency and effectiveness. The pace of innovation in torture technology was remarkable for the medieval period. The environmental impact of medieval prison operations was severe but rarely considered. The massive amounts of human waste, contaminated water, and diseased corpses created public health hazards that affected entire communities. The air pollution from constant burning of contaminated materials contributed to urban smog. Prison operations essentially poisoned their surrounding environments. The architectural innovations pioneered by prison designers influenced broader construction practices. Techniques developed for creating maximum psychological impact in dungeons were adapted for other intimidating structures. The expertise gained in building secure, escape-proof facilities was applied to military fortifications and noble residences. The medical research conducted by prison operators, however unethical, advanced understanding of human pain tolerance, disease transmission, and psychological breaking points. This knowledge, while gained through horrific means, contributed to broader medical understanding that would benefit later generations. The moral cost of this knowledge was enormous, but the information itself had lasting value. The psychological studies conducted by prison operators on the effects of isolation, torture, and deprivation provided insights into human nature that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries. Their understanding of how to break human will and reshape personality through systematic abuse was remarkably sophisticated. This knowledge represented one of humanity's earliest forays into experimental psychology. The logistical expertise developed by prison operators in managing large populations under extreme conditions influenced military and urban planning. Techniques for controlling and processing thousands of people efficiently were adapted for managing armies, organizing public works, and administering cities. The organizational skills required for systematic torture had broader applications. The communication networks established by prison operators created some of medieval Europe's most efficient information systems. They could transmit news, techniques, and business intelligence across vast distances more quickly than most government or commercial networks. Their need for coordination and security drove innovations in coded communication and message security. The financial instruments developed by prison operators for managing complex payment schemes influenced broader banking practices. They created sophisticated credit systems, payment scheduling, and risk assessment tools. Some of the earliest forms of insurance and investment instruments emerged from the need to manage the business risks associated with systematic torture. Medieval prisons represented one of humanity's most successful experiments in converting human suffering into economic value while maintaining social control through terror. Every aspect of these systems was carefully designed, tested, and refined over centuries to maximize both cruelty and profit. They weren't the product of ignorance or primitive conditions, but rather sophisticated criminal enterprises operating within corrupted legal frameworks. The efficiency of medieval prison systems was truly terrifying. They could process thousands of prisoners annually, extract maximum value from each victim, and maintain plausible deniability about the systematic nature of their operations. They had solved the logistical challenges of large-scale torture while generating enormous profits and maintaining social control through fear. The legacy of medieval prison corruption extends far beyond its historical period. Many techniques developed by medieval prison operators were later adopted by totalitarian regimes, organized crime syndicates, and other institutions dedicated to human oppression. The medieval period essentially created the blueprint for systematic state terrorism that continues to influence authoritarian systems today. The normalization of extreme cruelty in medieval society reveals something disturbing about human adaptability. These systems didn't require psychopaths or sadists to function effectively. They just needed ordinary people who were willing to prioritize personal profit over human compassion. The participation of normal, respectable community members in systematic torture shows how quickly civilized behavior can break down when the right incentives are in place. The creativity displayed by medieval prison operators in developing new forms of torture and exploitation rivals any legitimate field of human endeavor. Unfortunately, all of this innovation was channeled toward maximizing human suffering for personal gain. The intellectual energy and organizational skills that could have built cathedrals or advanced science were instead used to perfect the art of systematic cruelty. The business models developed by medieval prison operators were so successful that they persisted for centuries with only minor modifications. The basic structure of systematic torture for profit remained unchanged because it worked exactly as designed, generating wealth for operators while maintaining social control for authorities. This consistency across time and geography suggests that medieval prisons represented an evolutionary peak in institutionalized evil. The acceptance of these systems by medieval society shows how completely communities can become complicit in systematic evil when they believe it serves their interests. People knew what happened in these places, supported the system financially and politically, and considered prison operators to be respectable members of society. The social approval of systematic torture reveals the moral flexibility of human communities when faced with perceived threats. But perhaps the most chilling lesson from medieval prison history is how legal frameworks can be manipulated to legitimize any level of cruelty. By operating within technically legal boundaries, prison operators could commit atrocities that would be considered war crimes today, while maintaining their status as law enforcement officials. The system demonstrates how easily the rule of law can be perverted to serve criminal purposes when those who make and enforce laws are themselves criminals. The medieval period created perfect conditions for systematic evil to flourish. Weak oversight, local control of justice, economic incentives for cruelty, and social hierarchies that devalued human life based on class status. These conditions combined to produce institutions that were more brutal and efficient than anything created by modern authoritarian regimes, showing what humans are capable of when moral constraints are removed and cruelty becomes profitable. Understanding the true nature of medieval prisons forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. These weren't aberrations created by monsters, but logical outcomes of systems designed by ordinary people who discovered that suffering could be monetized. The medieval prison system represents humanity at its worst: creative, organized, efficient, and completely without moral constraint when profit was at stake. The documentation preserved from medieval prisons provides a window into institutionalized evil that challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization. These systems show that technological and cultural advancement don't necessarily lead to moral improvement, and that sophisticated societies are perfectly capable of creating and maintaining institutions dedicated to systematic human destruction. The survival skills required in medieval prisons were so extreme that few people possessed them. You needed physical toughness to survive the torture, psychological resilience to maintain sanity under extreme stress, financial resources to pay the endless fees, and social connections to navigate the corruption. Most prisoners lacked these advantages and died horrible deaths while enriching their captors. The medieval prison system created a perfect storm of human evil: systematic torture disguised as justice, profitable cruelty operating within legal frameworks, and social acceptance of institutionalized brutality. It represents one of humanity's most successful experiments in organized sadism, efficiently converting human lives into wealth and power, while maintaining public order through terror. These institutions weren't historical accidents or products of ignorance. They were carefully designed machines for destroying human beings while extracting maximum value from their suffering. They show what humans are capable of creating when moral constraints are removed and cruelty becomes not just acceptable, but profitable and socially respected. The lessons from medieval prisons remain relevant today because the underlying human nature that created them hasn't changed. The capacity for systematic evil, the willingness to profit from suffering, and the ability to rationalize cruelty all remain present in human societies. Understanding these historical systems helps us recognize and resist similar patterns when they emerge in contemporary institutions. Medieval prisons represent the intersection of human creativity and human evil, showing how the same intellectual capabilities that build civilizations can also create systems for systematically destroying them. They stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for organized cruelty and remind us that moral progress is never guaranteed or permanent. The religious dimensions of medieval imprisonment reveal just how thoroughly the Church had become corrupted by the same greed and cruelty that defined secular prisons. You might think that church-run facilities would offer some mercy, some hint of Christian compassion in this world of systematic brutality. You'd be wrong. Church prisons operated on the same basic principle as secular ones: human suffering equals profit. The only difference was that they wrapped their torture in religious language, claiming that pain was good for the soul. Priests would tell prisoners that their agony was divine punishment, that God wanted them to suffer, that confession through torture was a pathway to salvation. The Church had developed its own elaborate fee structure for spiritual services. Want a priest to hear your confession before you die? That'll cost extra. Need last rites administered? Better hope your family has money. Even prayer had a price tag in the medieval prison system. The Church had monetized salvation itself, turning basic spiritual comfort into another revenue stream extracted from desperate families. But here's where church prisons got really twisted. They would offer reduced torture in exchange for larger donations to the church. If your family could afford to fund a new chapel or contribute to monastery construction, suddenly your chains might get a little looser, your food a little less contaminated. The church was literally selling reduced suffering as indulgences, creating a marketplace where pain had an exact monetary value. The theological justifications developed by church officials for their torture practices show remarkable creativity in rationalizing evil. They argued that physical pain purified the soul, that earthly suffering reduced time in purgatory, that confessions extracted through torture were more spiritually valuable than voluntary admissions of guilt. They had created an entire religious framework that made brutality seem holy. Church prisons also pioneered psychological torture techniques that were particularly effective on religious prisoners. They would force devout individuals to commit acts that violated their deepest beliefs, then charge them fees for absolution. They would deny communion to starving prisoners, withhold religious comfort from the dying, and use spiritual terror as another tool of control. The corruption of religious authority in medieval prisons had devastating effects on society's moral foundation. When the church itself was operating torture chambers and extorting money from suffering families, what moral authority did anyone have to challenge the system? The institution that should have been protecting the innocent had become one of their primary predators. Some church officials became expert at identifying which prisoners were most vulnerable to spiritual manipulation. They would study people's religious backgrounds, family traditions, and personal beliefs to develop targeted torture strategies. A deeply Catholic prisoner might be told that their suffering was punishment for sins, while someone from a different tradition might be threatened with eternal damnation unless they converted and paid appropriate fees. The record-keeping in church prisons was often more detailed than in secular facilities because church officials were obsessed with documenting the spiritual justifications for their cruelty. They maintained elaborate theological arguments for every torture technique, creating libraries of religious literature dedicated to explaining why causing maximum human suffering was actually a holy act. The training programs for church prison guards included extensive theological education alongside torture instruction. Guards learned not just how to inflict physical pain, but how to use religious guilt and spiritual terror to break prisoners psychologically. They could quote scripture while applying thumbscrews, pray while conducting rack sessions, and offer spiritual counseling between torture sessions. The international networks of church prisons shared not just torture techniques, but theological justifications across national boundaries. A new method of spiritual manipulation developed in one monastery would spread to church facilities throughout Europe within months. The church had created a global system for coordinating religious torture that operated with papal blessing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of church prison corruption was how it perverted the concept of sanctuary. Churches had traditionally offered protection to people fleeing persecution, but medieval church prisons turned sanctuary into a trap. People seeking religious protection would find themselves imprisoned in church dungeons, subjected to torture that was supposedly sanctified by God. The economic relationships between church and secular prisons created competition that drove innovation in cruelty. Church facilities would try to attract business by offering specialized torture services that secular prisons couldn't provide. They would market their ability to extract confessions that were spiritually validated, creating a premium market for religiously certified torture. Some church prisons developed signature techniques that became famous throughout the prison network. The penance rack was designed to extract both confessions and religious donations simultaneously. The communion chains were blessed by bishops before being used to shackle prisoners. The holy water treatment involved systematic drowning using consecrated water, creating a torture method that was supposedly spiritually beneficial. The psychological impact of religious torture was often more devastating than purely secular brutality. Prisoners who might have maintained some inner strength through faith found themselves spiritually destroyed when the very institution they trusted most became their torturer. The church had weaponized people's deepest beliefs against them. The theological debates conducted by church officials about optimal torture techniques show how completely they had abandoned any pretense of Christian compassion. They would argue about whether certain torture methods were more pleasing to God, whether spiritual pain was more valuable than physical suffering, and whether different techniques were appropriate for different types of sins. The canonization processes in medieval times sometimes included consideration of how effectively saints had tortured prisoners during their earthly lives. Church officials who had developed particularly innovative torture techniques or generated exceptional profits from prison operations were considered candidates for sainthood. The church was literally worshipping systematic cruelty. The educational institutions run by the church included courses on prison management and torture technique as part of their standard curriculum. Young priests learned torture alongside theology, studying how to extract confessions while providing last rites. The church was training generations of educated torturers who could quote scripture while inflicting maximum human suffering. The missionary activities of the medieval church included exporting prison torture techniques to newly converted territories. Church officials would establish prison systems in conquered lands, teaching local authorities how to operate profitable torture facilities while spreading Christianity. The church was literally evangelizing systematic cruelty as part of religious conversion. The architectural innovations pioneered by church prison designers influenced cathedral construction and other religious buildings. Techniques developed for creating maximum psychological impact in torture chambers were adapted for church interiors designed to intimidate congregations. The expertise gained in building escape-proof dungeons influenced fortress design and defensive architecture. The artistic programs sponsored by the church often depicted torture scenes as religious instruction. Church murals would show sinners being tortured in hell, using techniques identical to those employed in church prisons. This art served both as religious education and as advertising for church prison services, showing potential clients exactly what services were available. The musical traditions developed in church prisons included hymns designed to accompany torture sessions. Choirs of monks would sing during rack operations, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that enhanced the psychological impact of physical torture. Some of these musical compositions became part of regular church services, spreading torture culture throughout medieval Christianity. The manuscript traditions maintained by church prisons preserve detailed accounts of torture techniques and their theological justifications. These documents were copied and distributed to monasteries throughout Europe, creating a library of religious torture literature that influenced church practices for centuries. The church was systematically documenting and preserving knowledge about how to inflict maximum human suffering. The pilgrimage routes established by the church often included stops at famous prison facilities where visitors could witness torture sessions as part of their spiritual journey. These religious tourism programs generated additional revenue while spreading torture techniques and normalizing extreme cruelty as part of Christian experience. The miracle claims associated with church prisons often involved prisoners surviving particularly brutal torture sessions, which were attributed to divine intervention. These stories were used to justify even more extreme torture, arguing that God would protect the innocent while allowing the guilty to suffer appropriately. The church had created a theological framework that made any level of brutality seem justified. The relic trade conducted by church prisons included selling pieces of torture devices that had been used on particularly famous prisoners. These items were blessed and sold to other churches as religious artifacts, spreading torture culture while generating additional revenue. The church was literally marketing torture equipment as holy objects. The seasonal celebrations conducted in church prisons included special feast days dedicated to particular torture techniques or famous torture sessions. These religious holidays created regular opportunities for enhanced cruelty while maintaining the pretense of spiritual significance. The church had turned systematic torture into a liturgical calendar. The scholarship programs offered by church prisons provided advanced education in torture technique and prison management to promising young clergy. These graduates would go on to establish new prison facilities or improve existing ones, spreading expertise throughout the church hierarchy. The church was creating an educated class of professional religious torturers. The diplomatic missions conducted by church officials often included negotiating prisoner exchange agreements that facilitated international torture trade. Church representatives would arrange for prisoners to be transferred between facilities in different countries, creating a global market in human suffering managed by religious authorities. The legal innovations developed by church prisons influenced secular law throughout medieval Europe. Church courts pioneered techniques for extracting confessions through torture that were later adopted by civil authorities. The church was essentially writing the legal playbook for systematic judicial brutality. The medical research conducted by church prison physicians advanced understanding of human pain tolerance and torture effectiveness. This knowledge, while gained through horrific means, contributed to broader medical understanding that influenced both torture technique and legitimate healthcare. The church was conducting human experimentation under the guise of spiritual healing. The environmental management practices developed by church prisons dealt with the massive amounts of human waste and diseased corpses generated by their operations. They developed sophisticated disposal techniques and contamination control methods that were later adapted for managing urban sanitation problems. The church had become expert in managing the environmental impact of systematic human destruction. The technological innovations pioneered by church prisons included new types of torture devices specifically designed to incorporate religious symbolism. The cross-shaped rack, the crown of thorns headpiece, and the stigmata nail driver were all church innovations that combined maximum pain with spiritual terror. The church was literally weaponizing religious imagery. The insurance systems developed by church prisons protected them against revenue losses from prisoner deaths or facility damage. They formed consortiums with other religious institutions to share risks and guarantee steady income streams. The church had created sophisticated financial instruments to manage the business risks associated with systematic torture. The quality control standards maintained by church prison networks ensured consistent levels of brutality across different facilities. Church inspectors would evaluate torture effectiveness, revenue generation, and theological compliance at different locations. The church was operating systematic torture with corporate efficiency and religious authority. The international trade relationships established by church prisons facilitated the exchange of prisoners, torture techniques, and revenue between religious institutions across national boundaries. The church had created a global economy based on systematic human suffering that operated with papal blessing and diplomatic immunity. The retirement planning available to successful church prison operators included positions in monastery hierarchies and potential canonization for particularly effective torturers. The church provided excellent career advancement opportunities for those who excelled at inflicting religious suffering on fellow human beings. The legacy systems developed by church prisons ensured that torture techniques and business practices would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The church maintained libraries, training programs, and institutional knowledge that kept systematic torture alive long after individual operators died. The charitable activities undertaken by wealthy church prison operators used torture profits to fund religious construction, missionary work, and educational institutions. This philanthropy helped legitimize fortunes built on systematic cruelty while spreading church influence throughout medieval society. The political influence wielded by successful church prison operators allowed them to shape religious law and secular legislation in their favor. They would lobby for laws creating new religious crimes punishable by church imprisonment, expanding their potential market while strengthening church authority. Now let's examine how the legal system itself became completely corrupted by prison profits, creating a feedback loop where more laws meant more prisoners, meant more revenue for everyone involved in the justice system. Medieval law wasn't designed to protect the innocent or punish the guilty. It was designed to generate steady streams of prisoners who could be converted into profit. Judges, sheriffs, court clerks, and prison operators formed criminal conspiracies that controlled entire legal jurisdictions. They would meet regularly to discuss optimal sentencing strategies, prisoner allocation methods, and revenue-sharing agreements. These weren't informal arrangements. They were sophisticated business partnerships dedicated to maximizing profit from human suffering. The legal innovations developed by these criminal networks included new categories of crimes specifically designed to target profitable prisoner populations. Debt laws were written to ensure that poor people would be imprisoned indefinitely, creating reliable revenue streams. Blasphemy laws were crafted to capture religious dissidents, whose families might pay premium fees for better treatment. The court procedures developed by corrupt officials were designed to maximize imprisonment while maintaining the appearance of legitimate justice. Trials were structured to ensure conviction, regardless of evidence, with predetermined sentences based on prisoner profitability rather than crime severity. The entire legal process became an elaborate theatre performance designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes. The evidence standards maintained by corrupt courts made conviction virtually inevitable for anyone who couldn't afford massive bribes. Hearsay was accepted as fact, accusations were treated as proof, and denial of charges was considered evidence of guilt. The legal system had created a framework where innocence was impossible to prove and guilt was assumed. The witness intimidation techniques developed by court officials ensured that testimony would support profitable convictions. Potential witnesses would be threatened, bribed, or imprisoned themselves if they tried to provide evidence that might lead to acquittals. The courts had systematically eliminated any possibility of effective defense. The jury selection processes were carefully managed to ensure panels of people who understood that conviction was expected and acquittal was dangerous. Jurors who voted against court preferences might find themselves facing criminal charges, while those who cooperated could expect rewards and protection. The legal system had turned trial by jury into trial by corruption. The appeals processes were designed to be prohibitively expensive and virtually impossible to navigate successfully. Even when prisoners could afford to challenge their convictions, the same corrupt officials would handle appeals, ensuring that profitable sentences were maintained. The legal system had created perfect barriers to justice. The legal education provided to young lawyers and judges included training in corruption techniques, alongside traditional legal instruction. Law students learned how to identify profitable prisoners, how to structure sentences for maximum revenue generation, and how to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while operating criminal enterprises. The legal profession was systematically training its members to be professional criminals. The international legal relationships established by corrupt medieval courts facilitated prisoner exchanges and torture technique sharing between different kingdoms. Legal officials would negotiate treaties that expanded their markets and protected their operations from foreign interference. The corruption had become so systematic that it operated as international organized crime with diplomatic protection. The record-keeping systems maintained by corrupt courts were remarkably sophisticated, tracking prisoner profitability, torture effectiveness, and revenue generation with corporate precision. These documents reveal the industrial scale of judicial corruption and show how completely the legal system had been converted into a criminal enterprise. The legislative activities conducted by corrupt legal officials included writing new laws specifically designed to increase imprisonment rates and enhance torture authority. They would lobby monarchs and nobles to pass legislation that expanded their power while eliminating oversight. The legal profession was literally writing the laws that would maximize their ability to profit from systematic cruelty. The research and development activities conducted by corrupt courts included experimental legal procedures designed to streamline conviction processes and maximize prisoner processing efficiency. They tested new interrogation techniques, trial formats, and sentencing structures to optimize their operations. The legal system had become a laboratory for perfecting judicial brutality. The professional associations formed by corrupt legal officials allowed them to share techniques, coordinate pricing, and lobby for favorable legislation. These organizations operated like criminal syndicates, disguised as professional guilds, protecting their members while expanding their operations. The legal profession had become an organized crime network with government authority. The training programs offered by senior corrupt officials taught younger colleagues how to operate profitable court systems while maintaining public legitimacy. These educational programs ensured that corruption techniques would be preserved and refined across generations of legal professionals. The quality assurance systems implemented by corrupt legal networks ensured consistent levels of brutality and profit generation across different jurisdictions. Legal officials would inspect each other's operations, providing feedback and recommendations for improvement. The corruption had achieved industrial efficiency and standardization. The financial instruments developed by corrupt courts for managing complex bribery schemes influenced broader banking practices throughout medieval Europe. They created sophisticated money laundering systems, payment scheduling protocols, and risk management tools. The legal profession had become a center of financial innovation driven by the need to manage criminal profits. The diplomatic immunity claimed by corrupt legal officials protected them from prosecution while allowing them to operate international torture networks. They used their government positions to shield their criminal activities from oversight, while expanding their operations across national boundaries. The succession planning conducted by successful corrupt officials ensured that their criminal enterprises would continue after their deaths. They trained family members in corruption techniques, established hereditary court positions, and created legal dynasties that controlled judicial systems for generations. The retirement benefits available to corrupt legal officials included vast estates purchased with torture profits, noble titles bought through bribery, and positions in royal courts. The legal profession offered excellent career prospects for those willing to abandon any pretense of justice in favor of systematic criminal activity. The charitable foundations established by wealthy corrupt officials used torture profits to fund religious institutions, educational programs, and public works. This philanthropy helped legitimize their criminal activities while providing social respectability and political protection. The political influence wielded by corrupt legal officials allowed them to shape legislation, control royal appointments, and manipulate international relations in their favor. They had become a shadow government that operated parallel legal systems dedicated to converting human suffering into personal wealth and power. The intellectual traditions developed by corrupt legal scholars included elaborate theoretical justifications for systematic torture and judicial brutality. They wrote legal treatises explaining why corruption was necessary for social order, why torture was essential for justice, and why profit was a legitimate motive for legal officials. The legal profession had created an entire academic discipline dedicated to rationalizing systematic evil. Medieval society had created the perfect storm for institutionalized evil: economic systems that rewarded cruelty, legal frameworks that legitimized torture, religious authorities that sanctified suffering, and social structures that devalued human life based on economic status. These elements combined to produce institutions that were more brutal and efficient than anything created by modern totalitarian regimes. The efficiency of medieval prison systems was truly remarkable. They could process thousands of prisoners annually, extract maximum value from each victim, maintain social control through terror, and generate enormous profits for operators while providing legal cover for what amounted to systematic murder. They had solved all the logistical challenges of large-scale torture while creating sustainable business models that operated for centuries. The legacy of medieval prison corruption extends far beyond its historical period. The techniques developed by medieval prison operators influenced later authoritarian systems, organized crime syndicates, and totalitarian regimes. The medieval period essentially created the blueprint for systematic state terrorism that continues to shape oppressive institutions today. The normalization of extreme cruelty in medieval society reveals disturbing truths about human adaptability and social compliance. These systems didn't require psychopaths or sadists to function effectively. They just needed ordinary people who were willing to prioritize personal profit over human compassion. The participation of normal, respectable community members in systematic torture shows how quickly civilized behavior can collapse when the right incentives are in place. The creativity displayed by medieval prison operators in developing torture techniques and business models rivals any legitimate field of human endeavor. Unfortunately, all of this innovation was channeled toward maximizing human suffering for personal gain. The intellectual energy and organizational skills that could have built cathedrals or advanced science were instead used to perfect the art of systematic cruelty. The business sophistication achieved by medieval prison operators was remarkable for its time. They developed complex financial instruments, international trading networks, quality control systems, and professional training programs. They operated with corporate efficiency and governmental authority, creating criminal enterprises that were more successful than most legitimate businesses. The social acceptance of systematic torture in medieval society shows how communities can become complicit in evil when they believe it serves their interests. People knew what happened in these places, supported the system financially and politically, and considered prison operators to be respectable members of society. The moral flexibility of human communities, when faced with perceived threats, is truly disturbing. But perhaps the most chilling lesson from medieval prison history is how legal and religious frameworks can be manipulated to legitimize any level of cruelty. By operating within technically legal boundaries and claiming divine sanction, prison operators could commit atrocities while maintaining their status as law enforcement officials and religious authorities. The system demonstrates how easily justice and morality can be perverted when those who define them are themselves criminals. The medieval period created perfect conditions for systematic evil to flourish and thrive on an unprecedented scale. The combination of weak oversight, local control of justice, economic incentives for cruelty, religious sanctification of suffering, and social hierarchies that devalued human life based on class status produced institutions that represent humanity at its absolute worst. Understanding the true nature of medieval prisons forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, social organization, and the fragility of civilized behavior. These weren't historical aberrations or products of ignorance. They were logical outcomes of systems designed by intelligent people who discovered that suffering could be monetized and chose to build entire careers around that discovery. The documentation preserved from medieval prisons provides a window into institutionalized evil that challenges our assumptions about progress, civilization, and human moral development. These systems show that technological and cultural advancement don't necessarily lead to moral improvement, and that sophisticated societies are perfectly capable of creating and maintaining institutions dedicated to systematic human destruction. The survival rate in medieval prisons was so low that imprisonment essentially functioned as a death sentence carried out through prolonged torture rather than quick execution. The system was carefully designed to extract maximum value from each prisoner before they died, creating an economy based on the systematic consumption of human lives for profit and social control. Medieval prisons represent the intersection of human creativity and human evil, demonstrating how the same intellectual capabilities that build civilizations can also create systems for systematically destroying them. They stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for organized cruelty and serve as permanent reminders that moral progress is never guaranteed, permanent, or irreversible. The lessons from medieval prison systems remain relevant today because the underlying human nature that created them hasn't fundamentally changed. The capacity for systematic evil, the willingness to profit from suffering, and the ability to rationalize cruelty through legal and religious frameworks all remain present in human societies. Understanding these historical patterns helps us recognize and resist similar developments when they emerge in contemporary institutions. The medieval prison system created a template for converting human beings into profit that has influenced oppressive institutions throughout history and continues to shape authoritarian systems today. It represents one of humanity's most successful and enduring experiments in organized sadism, efficiently transforming human lives into wealth and power while maintaining social order through systematized terror. The scale and efficiency of medieval prison operations becomes even more horrifying when you understand the sheer volume of human lives they processed. We're not talking about a few dozen prisoners scattered across Europe. These were industrial operations that consumed thousands of people annually, each facility operating like a factory designed to convert living human beings into profit and terror. The daily intake procedures at major prisons were streamlined for maximum efficiency. New prisoners would arrive in groups, chained together like livestock being delivered to market. Guards had developed assembly line processes for stripping them of possessions, assessing their wealth, and sorting them into appropriate torture categories. The wealthy got measured for comfortable chains, the poor got fitted for instruments of slow death. Each new arrival represented a business opportunity that required careful evaluation. Guards would study prisoners like merchants examining goods at market, calculating potential profits, estimating family resources, and determining optimal extraction strategies. They developed sophisticated profiling techniques that would make modern marketers jealous, analyzing everything from clothing quality to speech patterns to determine earning potential. The intake interviews were masterpieces of psychological manipulation disguised as administrative procedure. Guards would ask seemingly innocent questions about family, occupation, and financial status, while simultaneously terrorizing prisoners with displays of torture equipment. They were gathering intelligence for future extortion, while breaking down resistance through fear and intimidation. The classification systems used by medieval prisons were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Prisoners were sorted not just by crime or social status, but by profitability potential, torture resistance, and family resources. Each category received different treatment designed to maximize revenue extraction while maintaining optimal suffering levels. High-value prisoners, those with wealthy families or valuable skills, were placed in what guards called the premium torture track. These individuals received specialized attention from the most skilled torturers, customized psychological manipulation, and carefully calibrated physical abuse designed to extract maximum payments without causing quick death. Medium-value prisoners got standard brutal treatment with periodic escalation designed to encourage family payments. Their torture was routine but systematic, following established procedures that balanced suffering with revenue generation. These prisoners represented the bread and butter of prison operations, providing steady income streams through consistent abuse. Low-value prisoners, those with no money or family support, were essentially discarded into the death zones of the prison. They received minimal food, maximum brutality, and were expected to die quickly to free up space for more profitable victims. Their treatment was purely sadistic, serving no economic purpose beyond providing entertainment for guards and terror for other prisoners. The seasonal variations in prison operations created additional revenue opportunities that guards exploited ruthlessly. Winter brought higher heating fees. Summer brought disease management charges. Spring brought cleaning costs. And autumn brought preparation fees for the coming cold. Every change in weather became another excuse to extract money from desperate families. The holiday seasons were particularly profitable for prison operators who understood that families would pay premium prices to ensure their relatives received slightly better treatment during religious observances. Christmas, Easter, and other holy days became opportunities for special torture packages, premium meal services, and enhanced visiting privileges, all at appropriately inflated prices. The inventory management systems developed by medieval prisons tracked everything from chain sizes to torture device maintenance schedules. Guards maintained detailed records of prisoner conditions, torture effectiveness, and revenue generation with the precision of professional accountants. These weren't chaotic dungeons, they were carefully managed torture factories. The supply chain management required for prison operations was remarkably complex. Guards needed steady supplies of chains, torture devices, contaminated food, and medical supplies for keeping prisoners alive just long enough to extract maximum value. They established relationships with blacksmiths, weapon makers, and corrupt merchants who specialized in providing tools for systematic cruelty. The quality control procedures implemented by prison operators ensured consistent levels of suffering across different shifts and different guards. Supervisors would monitor torture sessions, evaluate guard performance, and provide feedback on technique improvement. They had created professional development programs for systematic cruelty that rivaled legitimate trades. The customer service standards maintained by prison operators were designed to encourage repeat business from judges, sheriffs, and wealthy families who wanted specific enemies eliminated. They offered satisfaction guarantees customized torture packages, and flexible payment plans that made systematic cruelty accessible to clients with varying budgets. The marketing strategies employed by successful prison operators included reputation building through spectacular torture displays, word-of-mouth advertising through satisfied customers, and competitive pricing designed to undercut rival facilities. They understood that systematic cruelty was a competitive business that required professional marketing techniques. The expansion strategies developed by successful prison operators included franchising their techniques to other facilities, establishing subsidiary operations in different territories, and creating regional networks that shared resources and expertise. Some operators built prison empires that spanned multiple kingdoms and generated enormous wealth. The research and development activities conducted by prison operators led to continuous innovation in torture techniques, business practices, and facility design. They maintained experimental programs where new methods were tested on prisoners before being implemented more widely. The pace of innovation in systematic cruelty was remarkable for the medieval period. The training programs for new guards were comprehensive educational experiences that covered torture technique, business management, legal manipulation, and customer relations. New employees learned not just how to inflict pain, but how to run profitable criminal enterprises while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement. The performance evaluation systems used by prison operators measured guards based on revenue generation, prisoner mortality rates, torture effectiveness, and customer satisfaction. Guards who excelled at systematic cruelty received promotions, bonuses, and additional training opportunities. The prison system had created career advancement paths for professional torturers. The retirement planning available to successful prison operators included investment opportunities in other criminal enterprises, real estate purchases funded by torture profits, and succession planning that ensured their techniques would be preserved. Some guards accumulated enough wealth to purchase noble titles and establish hereditary torture dynasties. The international networks established by prison operators facilitated the exchange of techniques, prisoners, and profits across national boundaries. They created what amounted to multinational torture corporations that operated with governmental protection and diplomatic immunity. The scale of these operations was truly global. The technological innovations pioneered by prison operators influenced broader medieval technology development. Techniques for metallurgy, developed for creating better chains, were adapted for weapons manufacturing. Architectural innovations for escape-proof dungeons influenced fortress design. The expertise gained in systematic torture contributed to advances in multiple fields. The environmental impact of medieval prison operations was severe and long-lasting. The massive amounts of human waste, contaminated water, and diseased corpses created public health hazards that affected entire regions. Some areas near major prisons remained contaminated for decades after the facilities closed. The economic multiplier effects of prison operations extended throughout medieval society. Money extracted from prisoners' families created demand for luxury goods, funded construction projects, and supported entire communities of craftsmen who specialized in torture equipment manufacturing. Prison profits became a significant factor in regional economies. The social stratification reinforced by prison systems created rigid class hierarchies that persisted for generations. Families bankrupted by prison extortion remained poor for decades, while families enriched by prison profits established hereditary wealth that lasted centuries. The prison system essentially redistributed wealth upward through systematic torture. The cultural impact of medieval prison systems influenced art, literature, music, and religious practices throughout Europe. The normalization of systematic torture created cultural products that celebrated cruelty, romanticized suffering, and treated human pain as entertainment. Prison culture became mainstream medieval culture. The psychological impact on medieval society extended far beyond direct participants in prison operations. Entire communities lived in constant fear of arbitrary imprisonment, creating cultures of submission and compliance that benefited those in power. The threat of torture was more effective than actual torture for controlling large populations. The legal precedents established by medieval prison operations influenced law development for centuries. Procedures for extracting confessions through torture, methods for legitimizing systematic cruelty, and techniques for circumventing justice became embedded in legal systems that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The medical knowledge gained through systematic torture, however unethically obtained, contributed to broader understanding of human physiology, pain tolerance, and psychological breaking points. This information, while gained through horrific means, influenced medical practice and scientific development for generations. The architectural innovations developed for prison construction influenced broader building practices throughout medieval Europe. Techniques for creating psychologically intimidating spaces, methods for controlling large populations, and designs for escape-proof facilities were adapted for castles, churches, and civic buildings. The organizational expertise developed by prison operators in managing complex criminal enterprises influenced broader administrative practices throughout medieval society. Techniques for coordinating large-scale operations, methods for maintaining quality control, and systems for managing distributed networks were adapted for legitimate businesses and government operations. The communication systems established by prison networks for sharing information and coordinating activities created some of medieval Europe's most efficient messaging systems. Their need for security and speed drove innovations in coded communication and long-distance messaging that influenced broader communication development. The financial innovations pioneered by prison operators for managing complex extortion schemes influenced banking and commerce throughout medieval Europe. Techniques for risk assessment, methods for payment processing, and systems for managing international transactions were adapted for legitimate business use. The insurance systems developed by prison operators for protecting against business risks influenced broader insurance development. Methods for risk sharing, techniques for loss prevention, and systems for managing uncertain outcomes were adapted for legitimate insurance markets that emerged in later periods. The quality assurance procedures developed by prison operators for ensuring consistent torture effectiveness influenced broader quality control development. Methods for standardizing processes, techniques for measuring performance, and systems for continuous improvement were adapted for legitimate manufacturing and service industries. The human resources management practices developed by prison operators for recruiting, training, and managing torture staff influence broader employment practices. Techniques for identifying suitable candidates, methods for skills development, and systems for performance management were adapted for legitimate organizations. The customer relationship management systems developed by prison operators for maintaining relationships with judges, sheriffs, and wealthy clients influenced broader business development. Techniques for client retention, methods for service customization, and systems for relationship building were adapted for legitimate commercial enterprises. The competitive analysis conducted by prison operators to maintain market position influenced broader business strategy development. Methods for market research, techniques for competitive positioning, and systems for strategic planning were adapted for legitimate businesses competing in developing medieval markets. The brand management strategies employed by successful prison operators to build reputations for effective torture influenced broader marketing development. Techniques for reputation building, methods for market positioning, and systems for customer communication were adapted for legitimate businesses seeking to establish market presence. The medieval prison system had created what amounted to a parallel economy based entirely on systematic human suffering. The wealth generated by these operations rivaled legitimate trade and commerce, creating alternative power structures that operated alongside official government institutions. The political influence wielded by successful prison operators allowed them to shape legislation, control judicial appointments, and manipulate international relations. They had become a shadow government that operated parallel legal systems dedicated to converting human suffering into personal wealth and social control. The educational institutions established by wealthy prison operators used torture profits to fund schools, libraries, and research centers. These facilities produced educated elites who understood that systematic cruelty was not only acceptable, but profitable and socially beneficial. They were training future generations to view human suffering as a natural and necessary part of social organization. The charitable activities undertaken by prison operators used torture profits to fund religious institutions, public works, and community services. This philanthropy helped legitimize their criminal activities while providing social benefits that made communities complicit in systematic torture. People benefited from the proceeds of systematic cruelty and therefore had incentives to support its continuation. The religious institutions funded by prison profits became centers for developing theological justifications for systematic torture. Monasteries and churches used torture wealth to support scholars who wrote elaborate religious treatises explaining why causing human suffering was actually a holy act that served God's will. The artistic patronage provided by wealthy prison operators funded cultural productions that normalized and celebrated systematic cruelty. Paintings, sculptures, music, and literature created with torture profits helped embed systematic violence into mainstream medieval culture, making brutality seem natural and inevitable. The technological research funded by prison profits contributed to advances in metallurgy, engineering, and medical knowledge. While these developments had legitimate applications, they were initially developed to improve torture effectiveness and prison management. Scientific progress was literally built on systematic human suffering. The trade networks established by prison operators for importing specialized torture equipment, exotic prisoners, and luxury goods created international commercial relationships that influenced broader economic development. Prison operations became significant factors in medieval international trade. The diplomatic relationships established by prison operators for coordinating international torture activities influenced broader medieval diplomacy. Treaties negotiated by torture specialists affected relationships between kingdoms and shaped the development of international law. The succession planning conducted by successful prison operators ensured that their torture empires would continue for generations. They established hereditary positions, trained family members in systematic cruelty, and created institutional structures that preserved their techniques and business practices across centuries. Medieval prisons represented the logical endpoint of systems that valued wealth and power above human life. They show what happens when intelligent, organized people decide that other human beings exist primarily as sources of profit and entertainment. The efficiency and sophistication of these operations challenge our assumptions about medieval society and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. These weren't primitive facilities run by ignorant brutes. They were sophisticated business operations managed by educated professionals who understood psychology, economics, law, and technology. They had solved complex logistical problems, developed innovative business models, and created sustainable institutions that operated successfully for centuries. The medieval prison system created a template for systematic evil that has influenced oppressive institutions throughout history. The techniques developed by medieval prison operators were later adopted by totalitarian regimes, organized crime syndicates, and authoritarian governments. They essentially created the blueprint for state terrorism that continues to shape oppressive systems today. The normalization of systematic torture in medieval society reveals disturbing truths about human adaptability and moral flexibility. These systems didn't require psychopaths or monsters to function effectively. They operated successfully using ordinary people who learned to prioritize personal profit over human compassion when the right incentives were provided. The creativity and intelligence displayed by medieval prison operators in developing torture techniques and business strategies rivals any legitimate field of human achievement. Unfortunately, all of this innovation was channeled toward maximizing human suffering for personal gain. The same intellectual capabilities that could have advanced science or built magnificent systematic cruelty. The business architecture were instead used to perfect the art of sophistication, achieved by medieval prison operators, was remarkable for any historical period. They developed complex financial instruments, international trading networks, quality control systems, professional training programs, and competitive strategies. They operated criminal enterprises that were more successful than most legitimate businesses of their time. The social acceptance of systematic torture shows how completely communities can become complicit in evil when they believe it serves their interests. Medieval society knew what happened in these places, supported the operations financially and politically, and considered prison operators to be respectable community members. The moral compromise required for this acceptance reveals disturbing truths about human social psychology. The legal and religious frameworks that legitimize medieval prison operations show how easily justice and morality can be perverted when those who define them are themselves criminals, by operating within technically legal boundaries and claiming divine sanction. Prison operators could commit atrocities while maintaining their status as law enforcement officials and religious authorities. The economic impact of medieval prison systems extended far beyond direct participants. Families were bankrupted, communities were terrorized, and entire regions were affected by the systematic extraction of wealth through torture. The prison system essentially functioned as a massive wealth redistribution mechanism that moved resources from the powerless to the powerful through systematic violence. The cultural legacy of medieval prison systems influenced European society for centuries after the facilities themselves were closed. The normalization of systematic cruelty, the acceptance of torture as legitimate law enforcement, and the treatment of human suffering as entertainment became embedded in cultural traditions that persisted long after the medieval period ended. Understanding medieval prisons forces us to confront the reality that sophisticated, educated, religious societies are perfectly capable of creating and maintaining institutions dedicated to systematic human destruction. These systems show that moral progress is not inevitable, that civilization is fragile, and that the capacity for organized evil remains present in human nature, regardless of technological or cultural advancement. The lessons from medieval prison systems remain relevant today because the underlying human motivations that created them haven't changed. The desire for wealth and power, the willingness to exploit others for personal gain, and the ability to rationalize cruelty through legal and moral frameworks all remain present in modern societies. Medieval prisons represent humanity at its absolute worst: intelligent, organized, efficient, and completely without moral constraint when profit and power were at stake. They show what humans are capable of creating when the normal restraints of compassion, justice, and basic human decency are removed in favor of systematic exploitation. The documentation preserved from medieval prisons provides a window into institutionalized evil that challenges every assumption about human progress and moral development. These systems demonstrate that the same creative intelligence that builds civilizations can also create machines for systematically destroying them with ruthless efficiency. The survival rate in medieval prisons was so low that imprisonment functioned as a death sentence carried out through prolonged torture, rather than quick execution. The system was designed to extract maximum value from each victim before they died, creating an economy based on the systematic consumption of human lives for profit and social control. Medieval prisons stand as permanent monuments to humanity's capacity for organized cruelty and serve as warnings that moral progress is never guaranteed or permanent. They remind us that the same human nature capable of creating great art, advancing science, and building magnificent institutions is also capable of creating systems for systematically torturing fellow human beings on an industrial scale. The efficiency and sophistication of medieval prison operations prove that evil can be just as organized, innovative, and successful as good. These systems worked exactly as designed for centuries, generating enormous profits, maintaining social control, and satisfying the sadistic desires of those who operated them while providing legal and religious justification for systematic human destruction. The medieval prison system created a perfect intersection of human intelligence and human evil, showing how the same capabilities that advance civilization can also create institutions for systematically destroying it. They represent one of history's most successful experiments in organized sadism and remain relevant today as examples of what humans are capable of when moral constraints are removed and cruelty becomes profitable. The sheer scale of medieval prison operations becomes even more terrifying when you realize these weren't just local problems affecting a few unlucky individuals. These were continent-spanning networks of systematic cruelty that processed human beings like raw materials in a factory. Every major city had multiple facilities. Every castle had its dungeons. And every jurisdiction competed to see who could extract the most profit from human misery. Let's talk about what happened when you actually died in one of these places. Because that's how most prison stories ended. Your death wasn't treated as a tragedy or even as a failure of the system. It was just another business transaction that needed to be processed efficiently. Guards had developed streamlined procedures for handling corpses that would make modern funeral directors look amateur. First, they'd strip your body of anything valuable: your clothes, your shoes, even your hair if it was long enough to sell to wig makers. Nothing was wasted because dead prisoners couldn't complain about theft. Then they'd search your body cavities for any hidden coins or jewelry that desperate families might have smuggled in during visits. But here's where it gets really sick. Your death created additional revenue opportunities that guards exploited ruthlessly. They'd charge your family viewing fees if they wanted to see your corpse. They'd demand burial fees if your relatives wanted your body released for proper funeral rites. Some guards would even hold corpses hostage, refusing to release them until outstanding prison debts were paid in full. The disposal methods varied depending on how much money your family had. Wealthy prisoners might get individual graves in church cemeteries, assuming their families could afford the premium burial packages. Middle-class prisoners often ended up in mass graves with minimal ceremony, but poor prisoners. They were thrown into lime pits like garbage, their bodies dissolving into anonymous sludge that fertilized the prison gardens. Some facilities had developed what they called corpse recycling programs that would make your stomach turn. Bodies were fed to pigs that were later slaughtered for prison food. Bones were ground into meal that was mixed with prisoner bread. Fat was rendered into soap and candles that were sold back to prisoners' families. Nothing was wasted in the medieval prison economy, not even death itself. The record-keeping around prisoner deaths reveals the industrial efficiency of these operations. Guards maintained detailed mortality logs that tracked cause of death, time of death, disposal method, and revenue generated from the corpse. They analyzed death rates by season, by prisoner type, and by torture method, constantly refining their techniques to optimize profitability. But death wasn't just an end point, it was a marketing tool. Guards would display corpses as advertisements for their services, showing potential clients exactly what happened to people who couldn't pay their fees. Fresh corpses were arranged in prison courtyards like merchandise displays, complete with price tags showing what it had cost to torture each individual to death. The psychological impact of constant death on surviving prisoners was devastating and deliberate. You'd wake up every morning not knowing if the person chained next to you had died during the night. You'd go to sleep listening to the death rattles of people slowly expiring from torture injuries. The sound of bodies being dragged away became as routine as morning prayers. Guards understood that exposure to constant death broke people's will to resist more effectively than physical torture. When you're surrounded by corpses and dying people every day, your own mortality becomes impossible to ignore. The threat of death loses its power when death becomes a welcome escape from ongoing suffering. Some prisoners would actually compete to die first, seeing death as victory over their torturers. They'd refuse food, deliberately worsen their wounds, or provoke guards into delivering fatal beatings. The system had become so twisted that prisoners treated death as a prize to be won rather than an outcome to be avoided. The seasonal variations in death rates created additional business opportunities that guards exploited systematically. Winter brought hypothermia deaths that could be prevented with heating fees. Summer brought disease outbreaks that required medical payments. Spring brought flooding that demanded drainage charges. Every change in weather became another excuse to extract money from families trying to keep their relatives alive. The corpse trade that developed around medieval prisons created entire secondary industries dedicated to profiting from death. Grave robbers would steal bodies to sell to medical schools. Bone collectors would harvest skeletons for anatomical studies. Hair merchants would purchase scalps for wig making. Death had become just another commodity in the medieval marketplace. But perhaps most disturbing was how completely society had normalized this industrial-scale slaughter. People walking past prisons would see corpses being loaded onto carts like produce being delivered to market, and they'd barely glance up from their daily business. Death had become so routine that it ceased to register as noteworthy. The international trade in corpses and body parts created diplomatic relationships between different kingdoms based on systematic murder. Countries would negotiate treaties for exchanging bodies, sharing torture techniques, and coordinating disposal methods. Death had become a matter of international commerce and diplomatic protocol. Now let's examine the children who ended up in these hellholes, because medieval prisons didn't discriminate based on age. Kids as young as 7 or 8 would find themselves chained in dungeons, subjected to the same systematic torture as adult prisoners. The medieval justice system operated on the principle that if you were old enough to commit a crime, you were old enough to suffer adult consequences. Children's prisons weren't separate, gentler facilities. They were the same torture chambers that housed murderers and thieves, with kids thrown into the general population to survive however they could. Guards quickly learned that children generated premium profits because families would pay absolutely anything to protect their young ones from the horrors they witnessed daily. The torture techniques used on children were often more psychologically sophisticated than those applied to adults. Guards understood that kids broke faster under mental pressure than physical pain, so they'd develop elaborate scenarios designed to terrify young minds. They'd tell children that their parents had abandoned them, that their families had been killed, that no one was coming to save them. Child prisoners were valuable for another reason. They could be trained to become informants and assistants in the torture process. Guards would offer slightly better treatment to kids who agreed to help with torture sessions, creating a population of child accomplices who understood that survival depended on participating in systematic cruelty. The educational programs offered to imprisoned children were lessons in systematic brutality disguised as vocational training. Kids learned to operate torture devices, maintain prison equipment, and assist with corpse disposal. They were being trained to become the next generation of professional torturers, ensuring that the system would perpetuate itself. Some children who survived prison experiences grew up to become the most effective prison operators because they understood the system from a victim's perspective. They knew exactly which techniques were most psychologically devastating, which fears were most paralyzing, and which hopes were most crushing when destroyed. Their childhood trauma became professional expertise in systematic cruelty. The family destruction caused by child imprisonment rippled through multiple generations. Parents would bankrupt themselves trying to protect their children, selling everything they owned and borrowing money they could never repay. Siblings would grow up in poverty because family resources had been consumed by prison extortion. The economic impact lasted for decades. Child mortality rates in medieval prisons were astronomical, but death certificates would list natural causes rather than torture to maintain legal fiction. Kids would officially die from fever, weakness, or accidents rather than systematic abuse. The paperwork protected guards from accountability while families grieved children who had been murdered by the state. The international trade in child prisoners created markets where kids were literally bought and sold between different facilities. Some children were considered specialty items, particularly valuable for their psychological vulnerability or family connections. The medieval world had created a slave trade in tortured children that operated with full legal protection. But children also represented hope for prison operators because they had longer potential lifespans for profit extraction. A healthy child might survive years of systematic torture, generating steady revenue streams that justified the investment in keeping them alive. Kids were viewed as long-term assets in the prison economy. The religious indoctrination provided to child prisoners was designed to make them accept their torture as divine punishment. Church officials would tell kids that their suffering was God's will, that pain purified their souls, that resistance to torture was resistance to divine justice. They were being brainwashed to embrace their own destruction. The adoption systems that developed around medieval prisons allowed wealthy individuals to purchase children whose families had been destroyed by prison extortion. These adoptions weren't humanitarian rescues. They were business transactions where kids were sold to people who wanted young servants trained in absolute obedience through systematic trauma. Some child prisoners became so psychologically damaged that they lost the ability to function outside prison environments. When occasionally released, they would commit new crimes deliberately to return to the only world they understood. The prison system had created institutionalized children who couldn't survive in normal society. So there you have it, the brutal, unvarnished truth about medieval prisons. These weren't places of rehabilitation or even punishment, as we understand it today. They were profit-driven torture factories that consumed human lives for money and social control. The next time you complain about a bad day or feel like life is unfair, remember that you live in a world where basic human rights exist, where legal protections matter, and where systematic cruelty isn't considered good business. If this opened your eyes to just how dark human history can get, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that will make you grateful for the modern world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.